we would only be automatons. Moreover, unless there are evils in the world, dangers to be faced, suffering to be overcome, and so on, there could be no virtue, no courage, no patience. Therefore, for all we know, this is, on the whole, a better world for the evil that is in it. A world without evil would be a world without free beings capable of developing and exercising virtue. This rebuttal has its flaws and its complications, few of which we can get into here. However, the main difficulty can be appreciated even if we accept them. All they show is that the existence of evil can be shown to be logically consistent with the existence of the God of traditional theism. They do not, in any way, as Hume would put it, explain or justify the inference to the existence of God from what we know about the world. The point can be made this way. In the spirit of the design argument itself, on the basis of our knowledge and experience of the world, supposing the world has a cause, and that this cause bears some remote analogy to intelligent design, it is the attribution of the traditional moral attributes of the deity. Is that the most plausible hypothesis? I don't see how this could be supported. Indeed, John Henry Newman, whom I mentioned earlier, did not make use of the design argument in his defense of the rationality of religious belief for just this reason. The design argument, he said, at best teaches us of God's power and wisdom, but nothing of his justice or mercy, which things are of the essence of religion. Newman, as it turns out, read as Hume, and was aware of the limits of the design argument, in particular, and of natural theology, that is, the effort to provide evidence for God from the evidence of God's existence from nature. Perhaps the most common question which traditional theists ask us theists has to do with morality. I know Garrett's going to talk a bit more about this later on. Without God, what do we base our moral decisions on? If there is a moral law, must there not be a lawgiver? Shades of this argument can be found in hosts of Christian writers, most notably C.S. Lewis, who defends a position like this in Mere Christianity. It is, however, a weak and confused argument whose flaws were exposed centuries ago by Plato. In his dialogue, the Euthyphro, Socrates is depicted as on his way to his trial, at which he will, among other things, be charged with impiety. Outside the court, he meets Euthyphro, a self-styled expert on matters religious. In his customary way, Socrates inflates Euthyphro's ego by expressing his good fortune. He does not know what piety is, and was therefore expecting to have a difficult time defending himself. Now that he has met the great expert on piety, whom he trusts will instruct him about the nature of piety, he feels invigorated. In the course of the dialogue, several different definitions of piety are proposed, and Socrates proceeds to show flaws in all of them. I'll focus on only one definition. Euthyphro defines piety as what is pleasing to or dear to the gods. For our purposes, I will revise the interchange a bit. Suppose we say that that which is moral is what God commands. Correlatively, that which is morally wrong is what God prohibits. Socrates poses a question at this point. Are things commanded by God because they are moral? Or are they moral because they are commanded by God? If it is the former, which, by the way, is what Euthyphro agrees to, then we are in effect conceding that morality is not determined by divine command. God commands certain things because he knows that they are moral. Morality is thus independent of God's will. Morality does not, therefore, depend on belief in or beliefs about God. On the other hand, if you say that things are moral simply because they are commanded by God, then two things follow. First of all, God's commands are completely arbitrary, his having no reason for issuing the commands he issues. If he had a reason, then whatever that reason would be might serve as a moral standard independent of God's endorsing it with his will. Secondly, God's commands cannot themselves be good, and we have no reason for praising him for his goodness. As Hume might say, it would make no sense to ascribe moral attributes to God. Either horn of the dilemma creates problems for the traditional theist. Morality, therefore, cannot be said coherently to be based on belief in God or beliefs about what God commands. In short, I see no reason to believe that God exists. While there are many more arguments for God's existence, only one of which we have even mentioned, I do not think that any of them establishes even the probability of God's existence. But am I not guilty of fallaciously arguing that since there is no proof of God's existence, then that constitutes a proof of or evidence of God's non-existence? Well, in a manner of speaking, yes. But such arguments are not always fallacious. Let me again explain by returning to the argument from design. The argument from design can be looked on as an analogical argument, as I have done here. However, it can also be looked upon as an explanatory argument, what a philosopher calls an inference to the best explanation. Understood as an explanatory argument, the design argument goes something like this. It is a fact about nature, think here especially of biological systems, that it exhibits order and pattern. What is the best explanation of this order? When the options are, as they were until Darwin, chance or design, clearly design was the better explanation, the better explanatory hypothesis, as it were. The pivotal role of Darwin in this debate is that he proposed a third alternative, a descent with modification from common ancestors by natural selection. I do that with my students all the time. Remember, rather than talk about evolution, except you have to have wind, always say descent with modification from common ancestors by natural selection, because that's really what he meant. Darwin's hypothesis is by far the best explanation compared to design or chance. It is better than design because, as Stephen Jay Gould has pointed out in an essay entitled Senseless Signs of History, organisms show evidence of their historical descent from earlier forms of life. The best evidence for evolution's superiority over design is not the perfection of the adaptation of an organism to its environment, but the imperfections of that fit. If God had designed a beautiful machine to reflect his wisdom and power, he would not have used a collection of parts generally used for other purposes. Optimal design is what one would expect if the world were designed by an infinite God. But we don't find optimal design. We find instead structures that are jury-rigged from components made available by historical circumstances. This is where bad knees and lower back pain come from, for instance. It is also where one of Gould's favorite examples, the panda's thumb, comes from. You know, you're familiar with the panda's thumb. The panda doesn't have a thumb. It's got 5 digits like everybody else, but the bone on the wrist sort of sticks out, and it's when they eat their bamboo, the bamboo is stuck between the bone and the thumb digit. And it looks like he's got a thumb, but it doesn't. It's not a very good thumb. You can't grasp things with it. The panda's thumb. From descent with modification from common ancestors, that's what we would expect, a jury-rigged construction. That's not what we should expect from divine design. Therefore, a naturalistic explanation of the order of nature is a better explanation of the evidence than the hypothesis of intelligent design. But does all this establish atheism? Isn't it still possible that there's some God directing evolution, even though the process itself proceeds by purely naturalistic principles? Well, that's possible. But it's also possible that my car is really directed by little gremlins, even though they operate through strictly mechanical principles. But such bare and fanciful possibility is not a sufficient reason for belief. We are justified in denying the existence of my mechanical gremlins because they play no explanatory role in understanding how my car works. By the same argument, God's existence plays no explanatory role in understanding how our world works. We live by such explanatory probabilistic arguments. As the great French mathematical physicist Laplace said when asked where God fit in his universe, "I have no need of that hypothesis." Thank you.